Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to talk about the Anbernic RG34XX. Now this is the latest in the XX line of devices from Anbernic, which means that you can expect it to be around $70 or so and play up through PS1 plus a few others after that. But the thing that really makes this one stand out is that it looks like a pitch-perfect replica of the original Game Boy Advance from back in 2001. And I know there are a lot of people who have precious memories and nostalgia associated with this form factor, and so I think the hype for this one is pretty high. And I think this time around, Anbernic really nailed what the audience is looking for. It's a 3:2 aspect ratio screen, which means it's going to be a perfect fit for Game Boy Advance. It's also 720 by 480 in resolution, which makes it a 3x integer scale. And some of these colors are an excellent match for the old school models as well. Now, this is probably blasphemy, but I never owned the original Game Boy Advance back in the day. I just missed this whole generation, and so I don't have that same level of nostalgia when it comes to this particular handheld. Instead, I'm going to try to look at it a little bit more objectively and see how it stacks up against other options that we have on the market today. Either way, if you are interested in picking up this handheld and you want to double check that it is going to be a good match, this is the video for you. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's get started with the specs, and some of this is not going to be surprising at all. The internals are like any other Anbernic device, so it's running the all-winner H700 with a gig of RAM. For storage, we have two microSD card slots, one for the OS and then another one for your games. But things get interesting when we start talking about the display. This is 3.4 inches, which is why it's called the 34XX, and it has a resolution of 640 by 480, giving it a 3:2 aspect ratio. This will give you a 3x integer scale of the original Game Boy Advance, and then also it's about a ½ inch larger than the original 2.9 inch display. The batteries have a pretty standard size, it's 3500 milliamp hours, and I found that it's given me about 6 hours of mixed gameplay. And in terms of weight, it's 188 grams or 6.5 ounces, which is about 40 grams heavier than the original Game Boy Advance. Now, in terms of connectivity and features, they're all the same as the other XX devices, so 5 GHz Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 4.2, as well as mini HDMI output. Now, if you've never tried one of these devices before, you might be wondering what systems you'll actually be able to play. And really, everything that you see here is going to play just fine. Basically, everything up through the PlayStation 1 is going to run great. This is going to include all your typical Nintendo and Sega systems and some of the stuff that's a little bit more obscure. Now, there are also other systems that will work, but not fully. So stuff like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, these are going to work, but don't expect more than like half of the games to play well. And you're going to have a lower rate of success when it comes to PlayStation Portable, and even worse when it comes to Sega Saturn. Only a few games will actually play. So for these, I characterize them as being nice to have systems, but not worth buying the device for. But let's face it, I think most people are going to be buying this thing to play Game Boy Advance games, so we will spend a lot of time talking about this one. Now, at the time of this video release, the device is not out yet. It comes out tomorrow, but I already know the pricing. The retail price is going to be $70 plus shipping, and then for the first 3 days, it'll be $64 plus shipping instead. And generally, shipping will be about $10 to the United States, and it'll vary depending on where you live. So really, worst case scenario, you'll be looking at somewhere around $80, but it'll often be dropping down on sale. Generally, what happens with these devices is that once third-party retailers get their hands on it, they start competing, and so it drops the price a bunch. So I wouldn't be surprised several months from now to see this device available for around $50 or $60 when on sale. Now, in terms of color options, we've got 4. We've got an original indigo as well as a black color, but then we also have 2 transparent colors as well. And hopefully they'll expand these colors if it becomes a popular handheld, so maybe we'll see something like Arctic Blue. Either way, let's go ahead and jump into the review, and like always, all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Now, first thing you might notice right off the bat is this box looks very different than other Anbernic releases. In fact, it has an uncanny resemblance to the original Game Boy Advance packaging from Japan. And this obviously is too close for coincidence, and so I think that it's kind of neat that they are trying to lean really heavily into updating the Game Boy Advance, but man, they are flying very close to the sun. Either way, let's take a look at what we can find inside of the box. And first thing I noticed is that they included a 64GB card, which is going to be filled with games. And it is worth noting, if you buy this device at the cheapest price point, it's going to come with a 32GB card that doesn't have any games on it. And so you will have to load your own game files, which I think is probably the best way to go anyway, but if you want to have a game card, you will have to pay a little bit of a premium. And that upgraded card is something like $5 or $8 that you'll have to add on to your final total. Also inside the box, it comes with a screen protector as well as a quick start guide. This will walk you through all the hotkeys and how to navigate the operating system. It also comes with a USB-A to USB-C cable, and as part of this review, I did test out the charging. And using one of these A to C cables seems to work pretty well depending on the charging brick that you're using. And so this is generally my recommendation with any of these XX devices, is to use the cable that it comes with and then also one of those low voltage bricks. For example, here I've got a 65 watt charger plugged into my 100 watt cable, and this does not charge anything at all. And again, this is like all the other XX devices, so it doesn't look like they've really upgraded anything when it comes to this one in particular. Now, one surprise in the box is a lanyard, and they've got a little lanyard hole like the original Game Boy Advance, so you just slide it through and then you can attach it. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a device that not only looks like it came from 2001, but kind of functions like it as well. Now, personally, I can't see myself using a wrist strap like this just to make sure I don't drop my handheld, but you never know, this might be great for kids. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the device itself, and so this one here is the Indigo model. And even though I don't have an original Game Boy Advance on me to directly compare with, this seems like a perfect replica right here. Everything down to the shape of the device and the cornering and the borders around the edges of it, even the back feels like the original model. Now, even though I don't have an original model to compare with, I do have something that's very close. This is an old modded Game Boy Advance that has a CM4 chip inside of it, so basically a Raspberry Pi 4. But the thing is, this was made with a third-party replacement shell, so it's almost identical to the original Game Boy Advance. And so I think this is going to be a good comparison just in terms of shape and size, if not necessarily the controls. This one's quite a bit different in certain aspects, like they sandwiched in a 4x3 display, and they also added 4 face buttons, as well as a PS Vita analog stick. So in terms of controls, I don't want to compare the two, but when it comes to just the overall shape and size between this third-party shell and this one here from Anbernic, you can see that they are basically identical. There are definitely some differences, like the cartridge slot as well as the AA battery compartment. But in terms of shape and ergonomics, they are basically identical. In fact, it makes me think that Anbernic just started with a third-party shell as their basis as they were making the overall design of this handheld. Even the screw holes on the back are in the exact same spot, so yes, these shells are very, very similar. Often we will see Anbernic make something that's kind of in the spirit of other handhelds, but I feel like this one is more like a direct copy. And I think for people who are really trying to capture that nostalgic feeling of using one of these old consoles, I'm sure they're very happy about this. So long story short, yes, this does look and feel like an original Game Boy Advance. Now, chances are, if you're watching this video and you are interested in this product, you may have owned a Game Boy Advance back in the day, but you might not own one right now. And so next, I want to take a look at the Anbernic RG34XX in the context of 2024. How does this stack up in terms of size and everything else compared to other handhelds that are available right now? Let's start by talking about other devices that have a similar screen, including the original Anbernic RG351P. This one came out back in 2020, but it has a 3:2 aspect ratio display. It's 3.5 inches, so slightly larger, but then also a lower resolution, only 480 by 320. So this one is a 2x integer scale of the original Game Boy Advance. And back around this time, we had quite a few others. In fact, I still have one here in the studio. This is the Powkiddy RGB10. And again, this one had that 3.5 inch screen, 3:2 aspect ratio, and it also is a 2x integer scale of Game Boy Advance. Now, just this year, Powkiddy went right back into the world of these older handhelds. They released this one called the V10. This one has that same 3.5 inch screen and that 2x integer scale, but with a vertical form factor. The nice thing about this one is that it's a lot cheaper. I think it's $40 retail. You can often find it for cheaper as well. And so this one's about half the price of the Anbernic that we're reviewing today. But I would say in terms of build quality and nostalgic form factor and also the higher resolution that the Anbernic is probably a more solid investment. Now on the high-end scale of Game Boy Advance-like screens, I would say that the next would be the Ayaneo Pocket Micro. This one has a 4x integer scale of Game Boy Advance, so a higher resolution but is quite a bit more expensive. Now honestly, the best analogy between the two I think is going to be the Anbernic RG35XX-H. This one has the same chipset and features as the Game Boy one that we're reviewing today, but it has a 3.5 inch 4:3 aspect ratio display instead. And it is pretty interesting how this all plays out when it comes to playing both Game Boy Advance and non-Game Boy Advance games when comparing the two. For example, using the 35XX-H to play Game Boy Advance games will give you a smaller size. It's going to be a little bit less than 3.3 inches, so just a little bit smaller than the 34XX that we're reviewing today. But on the flip side, playing 4:3 content on the 34XX is quite a bit smaller. This is just over 3.1 inches compared to 3.5 inches with the 35XX-H. So even though yes, Game Boy Advance content is larger on this 3.4 inch screen up above, the majority of all the other retro systems that you would play on this are going to be quite a bit smaller. Here's another XX comparison. This is the RG35XX SP. This one also has a 4:3 aspect ratio 3.5-inch screen like the device we were just comparing with. So it is a bit apples to oranges, especially because this is a clamshell device, so it's almost a vertical device compared to horizontal. But the nice thing about this one is that it does close up quite small even compared to the 34XX. Another budget horizontal Anbernic device would be the RG Cube XX. Again, same chipset here, but this one has a square aspect ratio screen. But as you can see in a side-by-side comparison like this, it's actually about the same size between Game Boy Advance with these two systems. You're just going to get a lot of bezels on the top and bottom with the Cube instead. Now, one handheld that is quite a bit different is going to be the RG40XXH. This one has a 4-inch 4:3 screen, and you can see that this one is actually 3.8 inches when playing Game Boy Advance content. And so even though this one is slightly larger than the 34XX overall, the screen is quite a bit bigger by comparison. Another thing to make note of is the overall bezels around the screen on the 34XX, because they are relatively thick compared to other consoles. A good illustration of my point would be the Retroid Pocket Mini, which has a bezel-less cover to it. The black bars around the 34XX are just quite a bit more prominent by comparison. And then finally, if you're really trying to get a good idea of the size, I think that a Steam Deck OLED is going to be your best bet, and so here's a comparison of the two right here. Long story short, this thing just looks and feels like a Game Boy Advance. I don't know what else to say at that point. It is pocketable, and it's a little bit thick like the original Game Boy Advance was too. It doesn't have that same thin and sleek feel to it compared to some of the more contemporary handhelds, but I also kind of like that old nostalgic form factor. In the end, this is a chunky little handheld, and that was always the point. And I think in wrapping up when it comes to just this overall size comparison is that this does feel like a replica of the Game Boy Advance, not something inspired by it, but just directly copied from it. If you look at the RG35XX SP against a real SP, you can see that yes, there is definitely some inspiration here. It's definitely not a one-to-one match. This one is thicker and larger, but it still has the spirit of the overall handheld. Meanwhile, the 34XX just feels like the original Game Boy Advance, for better or for worse. Okay, so now let's take a look at the controls. I want to start with the D-pad. This is a very different D-pad from your typical Anbernic devices. It still has that rubber membrane connection like you would expect from other Anbernic handhelds, but it is quite small and has a large pivot to it. And again, this reminds me very much so of the original GBA, and so I would think that this is probably a one-to-one replica again. And of note, the GBA D-pad was quite small. You can see here that it's about 17.75 millimeters. And if we compare that to a typical Anbernic D-pad, that's about 4 millimeters thinner in both width and height. It's really only slightly larger than the very small D-pad found on their micro device, the RG28XX. Now, when it comes to practical use case, I found that this one completely fails the contra test. This is where I push down the D-pad, then rock it left and right. And no matter how much I rock it, just ever so slightly, it does move the character, and so this can be a big problem when it comes to very precise platformers. In fact, in playing this game and similar ones to it, I found that many times when I tried to just duck, instead I would hit the diagonal, which would make my character actually move. And unfortunately, in a game like this, it is a matter of life and death, and so this is something that I probably would not really enjoy, playing something really precise like this on this particular D-pad. I also ran into some issues when it came to my other test, which is a Street Fighter test, to see how easy it is to hit a diagonal when I want to. And here I found that the constraints of an actual diagonal are really tight, and so you have to get it just perfectly in order to actually pull off a move. And so I was able to do my Hadoukens and Shoryukens, but it actually took quite a bit of work and practice to get to this point. And even then, I would say that maybe 3/4 of the time I would actually nail it, but often it would be kind of frustrating when I didn't. So in the long run, I would say that this is going to be a D-pad that is very similar to the original Game Boy Advance one. This one was not a perfect D-pad when it came to really precise controls. Now, when just playing a typical Game Boy Advance game, just kind of reliving your childhood favorites, I don't think this is going to matter that much at all. It's not like a false diagonal in a Pokemon game is going to be a matter of life and death. But when taken into context, I wouldn't say the Game Boy Advance D-pad just naturally is a good all-around D-pad when it comes to these precise controls. But again, I think when you're just running through the old Game Boy Advance catalog and just kind of fueled on nostalgia, that's not really going to matter. One other interesting thing I noticed about the D-pad is that because it's so small and close to the screen, I often would smudge the left side of the screen with my left thumb. And this basically would happen anytime I scrolled to the right, because it's just such a small D-pad and it has a high pivot to it, I would just kind of inadvertently also touch the screen. And so it is something worth noting is that you will find smudges on the left side of your screen, and this is something you may have to wipe down from time to time. Again, not a deal breaker, but I thought it was kind of interesting. So long story short, I think this is a faithful recreation of the Game Boy Advance D-pad for better for worse. Now also on the left side we have our start and select buttons. These also have a rubber membrane connection and are silent, so no issue here. Now let's look at the face buttons because this to me is really interesting. First thing worth noticing is this is not a typical diamond pattern. Instead, they just used the traditional BA pattern on the Game Boy Advance and put 2 buttons above it. And so the pattern here is a little bit off, especially compared to something like a PlayStation controller. However, I found that this actually works out really well with a lot of the classic systems. Things like NES feel very natural, and obviously Game Boy and Game Boy Advance will too. And I also found it easy to adapt to PS1 and Super Nintendo and Dreamcast with this setup too. The only one that was a little bit weird was Sega Genesis. So basically the ABC pattern is going to start at the top left button and then kind of work its way around to the A button as C. And so this is a little bit awkward, especially if you're going to look at the buttons while you're pressing them, but honestly, once you get a feel for it, it's not that big of a deal. Now the buttons themselves feel great. They have a matte kind of plastic texture to them, again like the original Game Boy Advance. And they also have a rubber membrane connection, really well made, and so nice tactile feel here and just, yeah, really good bounce. Now of note, these buttons are of different sizes, so the bottom buttons are actually quite large for an Anbernic device. They're about a 0.5 millimeter larger than your standard Anbernic button, and then these smaller buttons are also still not super small. In fact, they're about a 0.5 millimeter bigger than the buttons on the 28XX, which I always found to be a little bit too small. One other really interesting feature is that within the button itself, they've actually added the XY patterning on the transparent models. And so you can easily see which one is X and which one is Y on the transparent green and red. However, on the solid models, like the indigo one that I have here, you're not going to see it. So you're just going to have to remember which one is X and which one is Y. Now below the face buttons on the right side, we have our single mono speaker. Let's do a quick audio test. And so here is Streets of Rage 2 running at full volume. Now, first impression, this does get very loud. In fact, quite a bit louder than you probably would need. And the audio here is distinctly mono, and so if you're looking for a stereo sound experience, you're going to have to use headphones. But in terms of sound quality, with a cheaper handheld like this, I have pretty low expectations. I would say it doesn't have rich bass, but it's still sharp and clear. Also on the right side, we have our LED power indicator, and you can turn this off in the settings if you don't want it on while you're playing. Now let's take a look at the top, starting with the I/O. On the far left, we have a reset button, then we have our USB-C charging and peripherals port. After that, we've got a mini HDMI output, so what you would need here is just an HDMI to mini HDMI cable or an adapter. From there, just plug it into a monitor or TV and you will have direct video and audio. And of note, with the default settings, everything is going to scale appropriately on a 16:9 display. So in navigating through the menu, you can see that nothing is really squished. And same thing with playing a game that's not going to be native 16:9. It's going to provide bezels on the left and right and then scale it appropriately. For example, with Game Boy Advance games, you will have a slight border on the left and right because 3:2 is a bit thinner than 16:9. And when playing systems that are even thinner, like, Sega Genesis or even, the original Game Boy, yes, they'll still have borders and these are playable. Now, further on the right, we have our M or menu button. So this is going to be our hotkey. And I gotta say, the placement here is relatively awkward. It's hard to hit this as well as the other hotkeys at the same time. But I will show you later in the video how you can just map this to the select button to make it a lot easier on you. It's pretty easy. Now behind that I/O, we've got 2 SD card slots. It'll come with that 32GB card like I mentioned before. And my unit here came with a Kyokusub card. This is actually a pretty decent card, so this is the one I'm going to use throughout the life of this device. Now let's take a look at these shoulder and trigger buttons, because these are pretty interesting as well. Now these look a lot like the original Game Boy Advance, but they're not clicky or loud. In fact, they are relatively silent, which is kind of rare with some of these cheaper handhelds. And so it has a very satisfying feel to it, like a rubber membrane button. So a little bit on the mushy side, but still very satisfying. And I think it's pretty clever the way that they added trigger buttons as well. They're on the back shelf, but they also have that same rubber membrane kind of feel to them. And so they're kind of hidden out of the way on the back, but they're also very, very quiet when you press down on them. Let's do a quick audio test so you can see just how quiet they are, even with a mic like only a few inches away. So yes, I think this is a device that can be easily played next to a sleeping significant other without waking them up, so I think that's pretty great. Now, in terms of ergonomics, I've found that I mostly will rest my index finger in this space between the shoulders and triggers. It's kind of a tight spot, so if you've got big hands, it might not be the most comfortable, but I like this position because it's easy to grab both the shoulder or the trigger button depending on what I want to do. The triggers themselves are pretty small, but most of the time, the systems that you're playing with this device, you're just going to use those for hotkeys anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. And given how faithful they were to the original GBA design, I'm not sure how they could have designed this any better. Now let's take a look at the back, and you can see right front and center we have this battery compartment. We'll do a teardown later, but for now let's just look at the transparent model. You can see that yes, this is where the battery is, so if you ever need to exchange it, it's just a matter of removing one screw and then taking out the battery. Now while we're looking at the back, let's talk about ergonomics, because we have that battery compartment shelf which just feels very 2001. Now I assume if you're watching this video you probably have adult-sized hands, so let me show you how I've been holding this with my medium-sized hands. And it really comes down to basically two different types of grip that you can do because of this battery compartment. The first I'm calling a knuckle grip. It's when I take my ring and pinky and just kind of curl them together and then push the knuckle against the battery compartment. And the grip here is pretty good, but it puts a lot of pressure on the top of your finger, and so it can hurt over time. So instead what I've been doing is spreading out my fingers a little bit more and then holding my pinkies underneath to support the weight of the handheld. Because it's a lightweight device, it doesn't really put any strain on my pinkies, but that allows me to kind of claw grip everything like this. Now, all things considered, the 34XX is a pretty small handheld, so there's not a lot of space for all of your fingers. So I do have to interweave my fingers around the first knuckle, which is never the best experience when it comes to holding a handheld, but I think it's pretty comfortable all things considered. When it comes down to it, it feels like this is a device made for much smaller hands. I think that somebody, around their teenage years or younger, they're going to have no problem holding this device. But for somebody in their mid-40s like me, it is a little bit weird just compared to all the other devices that I've tested over the years. The GBA has always been a unique feeling device. It's quite thick and then just kind of angular in all these weird spots. And I'm not saying that this is an uncomfortable handheld. In fact, if your hands just have the muscle memory of holding this, you probably will be delighted by holding this device. But for someone like me who doesn't have that muscle memory, and I'm kind of looking at it with a cold clinical viewpoint, it does feel a little bit awkward compared to other handhelds available on the market. It's definitely a 2001 feeling device, but that does mean that you're going to have to contend with 2001 ergonomics. So long story short, I think this is a device that's best suited for people with smaller hands, much like with the original Game Boy Advance. Like it or not, these devices were marketed towards children. Just look at the entire game catalogs. They're mostly made with younger audiences in mind. And so it is quite possible that at the end of the day, your adult-sized hands may not enjoy this as much as you remember. Moving on, let's talk about the bottom of the device. So on the right side, we have our volume wheel. And bear in mind, this is not a true analog wheel. You're not going to scroll it left and right to adjust the volume. Instead, this is a flick wheel. So it's a digital input that you would flick left and right to turn up and down. And I think from a design standpoint, this is pretty smart because it feels pretty nostalgic, but then also it's a digital input, which means it can be used for hotkeys. For example, when pressing menu and volume up and down, it'll adjust screen brightness, which is great from a secondary function standpoint. Next to that, we've got a headphone jack. I did some quick testing with it, nothing fancy, but I did plug it into headphones and had a listen, and everything sounded good. The audio was coming in stereo, and I wasn't hearing any crackling, so I think this will be pretty good connected to some headphones. Now, there isn't really anything on the sides other than that one lanyard hole, but it is nice to see that it has that same design with that extra ribbing around each edge. And again, this is very reminiscent of the original GBA, and I think it's a nice throwback. It makes it feel very retro and late 90s, early 2000s. Now let's talk about screen, starting with brightness, and I did find that the 34XX is not quite as bright as I would like. Here it is in a direct comparison with the RG35XX, both of these at 100% brightness. And I think you can see that there is a tangible difference between the two, and so the 34XX is a little bit dimmer than I would like. Now that does come with a trade-off because when you go to the dimmest setting, the 34XX is dimmer than the 35XX. And so it'll really depend on the context of what you're playing in. If you plan on playing this in the dark, I think it'll be an excellent fit. Not only does the screen get dimmer than some of its counterparts, but then also those shoulder and trigger buttons are super quiet, and so I think it's going to be a good in-bed device. It's really just a shame that it doesn't get quite as bright as I would like. For example, here's a look at Sonic the Hedgehog 2 at about 2 p.m., so right in direct sunlight. And even at 100% brightness, I would say this is completely unplayable, so you would not be able to play this if the sun is shining directly on your device. However, here's another shot of me around 5:30 p.m., so the sun is starting to set, and I'm at a park right here, and I'm underneath a tree as well, but you can see that, yeah, this actually looks pretty good. So it really depends on where you're going to play it. If you're going to be playing it in the evening time or somewhere under shade, I think it'll be fine. But if you are looking for the absolute brightest screen, then this is not going to be the best pick. Now in terms of picture quality, I think it looks pretty crisp. This is a 720 by 480 display, so not that much different from your typical 640 by 480 ones. But here with Sonic 1, I am using an interpolation shader, which is balancing out all the pixels, and I think it does look pretty good. If anything, my main complaint about this screen, other than its relatively smaller size when playing 4x3 content, is the size of the bezels around the edges of it. And again, if you compare that to something like the Retroid Pocket Mini, it's just night and day. It feels like this is playing in picture versus full screen with the Retroid Pocket Mini. But bear in mind, this is a totally unfair comparison because the Retroid Pocket Mini is a $200 device and has an OLED display, and so it does pop quite a bit more. And really, when it comes to the bread and butter of the RG34XX, which is going to be Game Boy Advance games, these look amazing. Here you can play it at full screen integer scaled, maybe throw on an LCD grid overlay like I'm using right here, and yeah, I think it looks great. So in the end, this device really does excel in what it's meant to do, which is to be an upgraded version of the Game Boy Advance, and in that regard, yeah, it's really succeeding. Before we get to gameplay, let's talk a little bit about the software experience. Now this device is brand new and it has a new aspect ratio and resolution, so none of the custom firmwares are working for it just yet. But we still have the stock operating system to work with, and honestly, it is not half bad. I don't see a lot of changes from previous versions of this firmware, except for here in the apps section. They've got a new app called Willy Willy, which I think is just a version of Bilibili, which is like their YouTube app. And so if you want to watch Chinese videos, you've got that option right here. Now, while we're here, let's go into the app section because there are some things that I think are worth checking out. First thing I recommend doing if you plan on playing this primarily in handheld mode is to turn the bezels from auto to manual. And that's because I found the default bezels to be pretty awful on this device. They did not scale them correctly when in handheld mode with this 3:2 aspect ratio screen. If we look at the original Game Boy, you can see that the bezels themselves have everything cut off. So like the B button and the select button, you can't even see the whole thing, and so it just doesn't look very good. I think Game Boy Color actually looks even worse because they just put some stripes on the left and right, and what is this supposed to actually be? When it comes to NES and Super Nintendo, they've got everything scaled natively to 8:7 aspect ratio, so it's going to give you square pixels, but I personally would rather play with 4:3. And when it comes to the 4:3 systems, I really didn't like these bezels either because they're cut off. So here playing Sega Genesis, you can see that it's cutting off the logo, and that just doesn't sit right with me. And it's going to be the same way with just about any 4:3 system, so it just looks a little bit weird, like they're using 16:9 bezels, but they squished them into a 3:2 display. So yes, I would recommend going in here, changing them from auto to manual. Another thing you can do also is go into the shader section. I like to set this to manual as well, and then configure my own shaders myself. And I've got a whole shaders guide about 480p style screens, and so I'll leave it linked down below. It's going to be a very similar process. Finally, the other thing I would recommend changing if you want is that you can change the hotkey in RetroArch to be the select button instead of the menu button. And this is going to make things a lot easier with certain button combinations. For example, when you're pressing M and then R1, this is really awkward to make a save state. But if you change the hotkey to select, it's pretty natural. You'll just press select and then R1, and that will save your state instead. And then finally, two other things you're probably going to want to know about the stock firmware. In these settings, there's the network settings. Here is where you can connect to Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth controllers. Also, if you don't like the menu navigation sounds, it's going to be under button sound. Just turn this off and it'll be silent. So in the end, I think the stock firmware is going to be just fine. It is a plug and play kind of experience. And so for the most part, I think that if you're just trying to get into the handheld, you're trying to get into your games, this will work fine. It's still very early in the life cycle of this device, so we don't have any custom firmware available just yet, but I am sure we're going to have some available in the coming months. Okay, I think we've picked apart the device enough. Let's move on to actual gameplay testing and show what the experience is going to be like on this screen. Let's start with the original Game Boy. This is a 10:9 aspect ratio system, so you are going to get some pretty thick borders on the left and right, even compared to a 4:3 screen. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color experience is going to be relatively small, about 2.8 inches altogether. And for context, that's about 0.2 inches larger than a Game Boy Color screen, so it is a little bit bigger, but not by much. So the way I see it, there are many different ways is that you can play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games that will probably give you a better experience, but it's not a bad experience here on the 34XX. Yes, it is a little bit on the small side, but thankfully, the text and the sprites in these systems were super large just to accommodate that smaller screen. So this is probably not a device you would buy to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, but they are certainly playable and they look great here on this device. But of course, moving up here, let's talk about Game Boy Advance, because I think this is the one that everyone is going to want to play. And I'm not really sure what to say here other than that it's a very excellent experience. I just set it to integer scaling. It's going to fill up the whole screen. And then I'm using an LCD3X shader. And so this gives your image a grid overlay, and it just looks and feels like an original Game Boy Advance, but maxed out to 11. And there is something special about playing these types of games on a device that feels like it's basically made to play these games. And of course, we've got all the lovely creature comforts that come with running emulation. So we have things like save states and rewind and cheat and fast forward. So there's many ways that you can enjoy these games that weren't originally available to you. And playing everything at an integer scale like this is just so effortless and feels natural, and so I really like this overall experience. Another system that is actually very similar to the Game Boy Advance in terms of screen is the WonderSwan Color. Now this was a Japanese system, so many of these games are going to run in Japanese, but there are English translation ROM hacks out there if you want to try them out. And the nice thing is that this is one of the only other handheld systems that had an aspect ratio similar to 3:2, so everything's going to look good here. It will have slight bezels at the top and bottom, but it is very hard to see them, and so I think this is actually an excellent fit. Now moving on to 4:3 systems, I did use an interpolation shader here to balance out the pixels, and for this video I'm using Pixel AA, and as you can see here with Mega Man's life bar, it balances out everything perfectly and it looks very crisp. And so this is basically what I used for all my 8 and 16-bit systems across the board. Now this shader is not in the stock firmware right now, but you can just turn on the online updaters, then download new shaders, and then you will find it within the shaders folder. So it does take a little bit of prep work to get this particular shader, but I found this one to be the best interpolation option for this screen. Now, like we discussed earlier, it is a pretty small image when playing 4:3 content on this 3:2 aspect ratio display. It's going to be about 3.1 inches altogether, so it is quite small compared to something like a 3.5 inch display. And so in this regard, I would say that if you have bad eyesight and you find that a 3.5 inch device is a little bit too small for you, this is in the opposite direction that you may want to go in. For my part, I did find it to be big enough to be enjoyable, but I also like micro-sized handhelds, and so this is not a huge deal for me, but if you have bad eyes, then this may not be a great option. Either way, when it comes to playing these older systems, all the performance stuff is absolutely fine. You're not going to have any issues with this chipset. And this is going to be the same case running all the way up through arcade systems as well. It's not going to be fast enough to play Killer Instinct, but basically everything below that will be just fine. But when it comes to arcade games in particular, vertical games are quite small. So you got a couple options here. You could rotate the screen, but then the controls are going to be very awkward, or it's just going to be very, very small when trying to play vertically on this display. Now, one surprising thing I found for me is that when I started moving up into the higher end systems, I got more and more of a thrill out of playing them on this little device. I think it has to do with the Game Boy Advance form factor, but it is kind of crazy to play a PS1 game on a Game Boy Advance. Even though I never owned a GBA back in the day, I remember a lot of people around me having them. I was on deployment a lot during this time, and people used to bring them on the ship and they would play things like, Metroid and Castlevania. And so it is just kind of crazy for me to see something like Tekken 3 running on this at the same time, because it's just kind of wish fulfillment for everybody else. Now, as you start moving into Nintendo 64, things do get a little bit more complicated because there were analog sticks and additional inputs with this device. But thankfully, the stock firmware has a fix for that. All you have to do is tap on the power button and it'll toggle between analog stick and D-pad input for Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP. And so with these systems, it is possible to use a left analog input using the D-pad. You just have to use that hotkey toggle. Now, in terms of performance, Nintendo 64 is not going to be the best, not only from performance, but from compatibility. The default emulator will usually be the fastest among your other options, but it's also the one that has the least amount of compatibility. And so games like Rogue Squadron just do not play at all. Now, to change out the emulator core, you just have to hover over the game and then press the Y button. That's going to be the one over the B button. And that'll give you a list of options here, and so let's switch it over to Mupen 64 Plus. And at least with this core, Rogue Squadron is playable, but it's not perfect. There are quite a few graphical glitches still. And unfortunately, performance is quite a bit worse as well, so this is not running at full speed, but relatively close. So when it comes to playing Nintendo 64, it's going to be a bit hit and miss. You just kind of have to try it, see which emulator core works the best, and whether or not the compatibility is going to make it playable. And like I mentioned, about half the catalog will be playable in some way or another. Now, thankfully, Dreamcast is a little bit bit easier to stomach. This one is using the Flycast emulator core, and it has an auto frame skip already embedded in it. And so this means that even if the game is not going to run at 60 frames per second, as long as it stays above 30, it'll usually be pretty good. It's not going to be a pitch perfect Dreamcast experience, but I would say that more games are playable with Dreamcast compared to Nintendo 64. Now things are a little bit different with PSP. This was a 16:9 system, and playing that on a 3:2 screen does mean it's going to get a little bit squished. For example, 16:9 content will be about 3.2.5 inches, so less than 3.4 inches of the overall display. And that's over an inch smaller than the original PSP, so things are going to feel and look a little bit squished. But again, this also kind of goes back to what I was saying about PS1, where it is kind of thrilling to play PSP games on a GBA. Both of these two systems were out at the same time. The GBA was discontinued back in like 2007, and so there were competitors, and it's kind of crazy to play these games on a GBA instead. But just bear in mind that performance is not going to be the best here either. It's going to run with an auto frame skip out of the box, and so it's going to be relatively playable, but not a pitch perfect experience. And again, I would say maybe a quarter or a third of the games are actually going to be playable. Okay, before we wrap up, let's do one quick teardown. So this is actually relatively easy to get inside. You're going to need a Phillips head screw to get in and take out the battery compartment, and then after you pull out the battery, there's going to be another Phillips screw underneath. From there, you've got 4 1.5mm hex screws that you need to remove. And there is a connecting clip near the top of the back shell, so you'll have to kind of wedge that out and then you can pull it free. Now the only main difference here with this device compared to others is that it uses a lot of ribbon cables. The shoulder and trigger buttons each have their own ribbon cable, and there's a connector between the front and back shell. And that's in addition to the display ribbon cable as well. So overall, you've got 4 ribbon cables that you have to remove just to take out the PCB. But some things worth noting, we've got our speaker on the bottom left, our Wi-Fi chip on the right, and then we have our rumble motor above the speaker. So long story short, when it comes to tearing down this device, I would say it's a little bit more advanced than your typical Anbernic device, but not bad. So if you wanted to swap out the buttons or the D-pad, you can definitely do that. Just bear in mind, it might take a couple minutes extra work to actually get inside of it. All right, I think we have poked and prodded this thing enough. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up, talk about what I like and what I don't like about the RG34XX. Number one, this thing is Nostalgia 5000. It is crazy how much it looks and feels like an original Game Boy Advance. At the end of the day, most of these retro handhelds are supposed to be nostalgia-inducing, and this one, even though it is flying very close to the sun in terms of patent and trademark, is also just very nostalgia-inducing. I also like the fact that it's using that H700 chip. Now I know a lot of people are tired of it. After all, this is the 9th device that Anbernic has released with this chipset. But there are definitely benefits of using the same chip across multiple devices. That means that custom firmware is very easy to get adapted to each of these devices. If you were around in 2021 and 2022 when Anbernic was creating all sorts of different devices with different chipsets, it was really chaotic. And having one simple standard for the low-end devices in their catalog is actually a really good thing from a user perspective. This means that we know exactly what kind of performance you can expect, but then also there's just a bunch of different shapes and sizes depending on what you prefer. And for this device, hands down, the number one reason to get it is if you want a nearly perfect Game Boy Advance experience. You've got a 3x integer scale with the screen, but then of course it just feels like a Game Boy Advance as well, and so I think it's really great. Obviously it's not going to be as accurate as FPGA or using an original console, but you know, emulation nowadays is still pretty good. And there are a lot of nice features that can only be found in emulation, things like fast forward and save states and rewind and all that. I also like the variety of color options that they're offering here. I think that all 4 look pretty good. I assume the indigo is going to be the best seller here, and hopefully that inspires them to launch other colors as well. And finally, one of my big takeaways of this device is that it felt like a really focused experience. It looks and feels like a Game Boy Advance and plays those games in particular really well. And I think at this $70 price point, it's a really compelling purchase even if you don't factor in all the other systems that it can emulate. For example, if you go on eBay and try to get one of those upgraded Game Boy Advances, you're looking at somewhere between $150 and $200 depending on the model that you want. These will generally give you an IPS display, so it's going to be backlit, it's going to look really nice. But some of these sellers will actually upcharge you if you want to have things like USB-C charging. Now another route you could do is just to upgrade an older GBA yourself. Say you don't have one already, you could buy one for around $75 used as well. But from there, there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done. You'll have to buy yourself a new shell, and that's going to be somewhere between like 15 and 20 bucks. And then you're going to have to buy some new buttons as well as some new conductive rubbers, and so that's going to cost another 10 or so. And after that, you'll have to buy a screen kit, and I would say the average going rate for something like this is going to be around $50 to $70. From there, you're looking at another $30 or $40 for a USB-C charging kit, and then you're probably going to want to upgrade the sound too, so that's going to be another speaker and then an audio amp, that's another $10. So in the end, putting together a Game Boy Advance yourself will probably cost upwards of $200 on its own. And that's not even factoring in an EverDrive or all the cartridges you'd have to buy to be able to play those games in the first place. Now obviously there's a big difference between emulation and original consoles, but I do think that at $70-ish, this is good enough. And again, that's not even factoring all the other systems you can play on the RG34XX. Now don't get me wrong, this handheld is not perfect, so let's go over some of the things I didn't really like about the 34XX. And I think the number one overlying thing is that this is a 2001 handheld that was built and produced in 2024. And a lot of things have changed over those 23 years. To start, you are probably now an adult and you don't have the same ergonomic needs as you did back when you were a kid. And I found that the ergonomics of this device are very true to the original Game Boy Advance, which many people with larger hands do not find to be super comfortable. And it'll really be a battle between how strong your nostalgia is versus how strong your hands are. In addition, I found this to be an imperfect D-pad. It is relatively small, and when tapping it a bunch, depending on the game that you're playing, it can get a little bit fatiguing. And also, the diagonal experience on this is not perfect. I found it to not be great when it comes to playing precision platformer games, and also not super helpful when it comes to Street Fighter games either. But it really will depend on the type of games that you're playing. For RPGs, it'll be no problem whatsoever. And then finally, the only other negative observation that I had for this device is that it is a slightly dim screen. If you're going to be playing it indoors, I think it's a non-issue, but if you do plan on playing it outside, especially in direct sunlight, it might be too dim. So in putting this all together, I think the RG34XX is a nearly perfect Game Boy Advance. It just is an imperfect device, all things considered. After all, this was a handheld that was marketed towards children, and I think that the primary buying audience of the 34XX are not going to be children. Now, if you plan on buying it as a gift for your children or maybe a young relative, then yeah, I think that'll be a wonderful experience for them. But if you're thinking about buying it for yourself, I've got a little quiz that I want you to take before you pull that trigger. And it's only 3 questions, and I'm not going to judge you on the answers, but let's go through them really quickly. The first question here is, do you have fond memories of the Game Boy Advance? By that I mean, did you own one, and did you love playing it, and you want to kind of recapture some of that experience? Number 2, I'm going to ask you just straight up, have you used a Game Boy Advance with your now adult-sized hands? If you've got one sitting in a box, I would recommend finding that box and going and grabbing it and seeing how good it actually feels in your hands today. Because chances are it might feel a little bit more cramped than your nostalgia actually is making you think. And my third question is, are you going to be okay with paying for this experience, even if it isn't as amazing as you remember? And the answers to these 3 questions don't really matter at all. It's just a matter of asking yourself that and seeing whether or not this is a good fit for you and your needs right now. When it comes down to it, $70 is still quite a bit of money when it comes to buying a handheld. And if you are looking for a Game Boy Advance recreation, then yes, there's nothing better out there than this one. However, if you're just looking for a nice horizontal handheld, I don't think this one is your best choice, even within the Anbernic XX line. In fact, there are many reasons why I think the Anbernic RG35XX is a better horizontal handheld overall. This one has that 3.5-inch 4x3 display, which is going to be compatible with more systems, and it also has dual analog sticks, which are going to be helpful with certain types of games, and it has stereo speakers. Not only that, it's a lot slimmer and thinner, so it's more pocketable, and I actually find this one to be more comfortable to hold and play. It's got a bigger D-pad and a nice flush back, which allows me to push my fingers all the way across. And so if you are looking to play a variety of types of games, not just Game Boy Advance, then I think that something like this will be a more comfortable and nicer to look at experience. When using the right interpolation shader and maybe a good overlay, you can get a nice visual experience even though it is only a 480p display. And honestly, you can still make it a pretty good Game Boy Advance device as well. You can throw on a GBA overlay to take over those black bezels on the top and bottom to make something that kind of looks like a GBA already. And if you're not beholden to the whole horizontal form factor, I think that the RG35XX SP is also an excellent experience. It's got the same screen, so you can do all that same magic when it comes to those overlays. And of course, it's got that wonderful clamshell form factor, which makes it very portable. And so in the end, if you are looking for a pure Game Boy Advance experience, then yes, the 34XX is probably your best bet in that regard. However, if you're more interested in an all-around handheld, then I think there are better options out there, including those within the XX line already. And So the way I see it, if you're looking for a recommendation of whether or not to pick up this device, it really comes down to what you plan on using it for. If you plan on using it mostly for GBA, or maybe even a dedicated GBA handheld, then this is a wild success. I can't believe that we even have a device that looks so close to the original model, but has so many great upgrades to it. It really is the ultimate Game Boy Advance, provided that you like this form factor and overall shape. And in the end, I think when you put it all together, this is a device that has way more positives than negatives, depending on whether or not you're going to use it in a specific context, because it is the ultimate Game Boy Advance, for better or for worse. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you thinking about picking this one up, and when was the last time that you actually held a Game Boy Advance? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.